Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Kurdistan Connection here on Media News with myself, Matt Broomfield. I'm very happy to be joined today by a guest who I'm sure a lot of you who follow the situation in Kurdistan will be familiar with from her commentary, her visits to the region, her academic work in the region. Amy Austin Holmes. Amy, you're welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much. Amy's expertise is not limited to Kurdistan. Amy is also research professor of international affairs at the Elliott School at George Washington University, among other positions, but she has spent a lot of time across the past several years working in and focused on the situation in Kurdistan. One outcome of that has been a book, Statelet of Survivors, which I had the pleasure of reading recently. Which offers a kind of fresh perspective in many respects on what is happening in the Kurdish-led regions of north and east Syria, known often by the Kurdish name Rojava. We'll speak about that book in the course of this discussion. It's an excellent book. It was published by Oxford University Press. If you would like to find it, we'll also include a link alongside this interview. There's a couple of things I want to cover today, but perhaps first of all, you can give an elevator pitch, to our audience. They know a thing or two about Kurdistan. They follow the situation in the region. What is the idea behind your book?
Great. Well, thank you again very much for having me, and I look forward to discussing this with you today. I wrote the book because even before the United States had gotten involved in supporting the Syrian Democratic Forces in 2015, the Kurds in the northeast and Assyrians and Syriac Christians had actually joined forces to combat the Al-Qaeda offshoot that was spreading in the northeast. So this was also before the Islamic State Caliphate had been officially declared. And within a few years, this non-state actor, this militia that didn't even have uniforms, evolved into a multi-ethnic, multi-religious force, which defeated the Islamic State, as all of your viewers know, of course. And so the question I think that many people haven't asked is, why did Kurds and Christians, Assyrians and Armenians back then join forces? I think this has actually often been overlooked, although I think it was a key turning point. And as you mentioned in the introduction, a lot of the analyses that refer to this region as Rojava, but if you simply see it as a Kurdish region or a Kurdish movement, I think that's too narrowly focused to truly understand the complexity of the present and past of this semi-autonomous region, what's now become a semi-autonomous region in northeast Syria. And so I believe that to really find the origins of northeast Syria, we have to begin at the time of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the formation of the Turkish Republic, when Kurds and Christians, Armenians and Assyrians, were faced either with annihilation in the 1915 genocide or forced assimilation. And so in an attempt to secure the continued existence of Kurds and Christians, they formed an alliance, an official alliance between the Dashnak Sutun, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, and Kurds in Khoybun, and declared an autonomous region on the borderlands of what is now modern-day Turkey and Armenia, known as the Republic of Mount Ararat. And so this is a little-known episode, actually, that happened beginning in the late 1920s and extended through the early 1930s. But I think this is key to understanding northeast Syria, because it shows that this cooperation between Kurds and Christians dates back a century. And so this is not just something that happened in 2012 or 2013 and that continues until now. It didn't just happen because the United States got involved, but this Kurdish-Christian collaboration predates also the PKK by more than 60 years. And so I think that if we, to really understand this region, we have to go back to the 1920s. And that's why in my book, I have a whole chapter on the Mount Ararat Rebellion, where I used archival documents that had not been used before, not been published before, from the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, as well as memoirs from some of the Kurdish and Armenian commanders of the Ararat Rebellion. But my point is that I think this collaboration between Kurds and Armenians and Assyrians in northeast Syria, that's now, of course, expanded to also include Arabs in northern Syria as they defeated the Islamic State and they liberated Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, Manbij, Tabqa, etc., Arab majority areas. The SDF also became an Arab majority force, which my survey data shows. And so, it's an unexpected twist of history that those who were once considered undesirable by the Ottoman Empire and the early Turkish Republic, in particular Kurds and Christians, they now form the core of an alliance that governs 1/3 of Syria.
So
and my
well, in
story of the semi-autonomous region and how the solidarity dates back a century.
As well as sort of showing this long-term history, you also suggest there are sort of useful parallels between the experience of this Ararat Republic and what's happening in the present day and how this model has developed and expanded and survived. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. So the Ararat Rebellion was, I think it was actually, there were a number of rebellions after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and in the period, as the Turkish Republic was being formed. Some of the more well-known rebellions include the Sheikh Said Rebellion, the Dersim Rebellion, Kochgiri. There were a number of official rebellions. One of the things that I cite in my book, I think, cites over 15 different rebellions within this period of the 1920s and 1930s. And yet the Ararat Rebellion is often overlooked. And, I actually think it was one of the most significant because they actually govern territory. I mean, they claim to control territory for 6 or 7 years, depending on when we, see this rebellion as having begun. Some people say in 1925, some people say 1926. The official Treaty of Collaboration was formed in 1927, actually in Lebanon. But it continued through approximately 1932, when it was finally crushed. And I think that, these other rebellions that happened in this period of the early Turkish Republic didn't involve the control of territory to at least to the same extent as happened in Ararat. And so that's the key reason why I think this is a parallel between what's happened after 2012 in Syria, but also because, those who survived the Ararat Rebellion or, the Armenian genocide were either deported during the genocide in 1915. They were deported, many of them, into northern Syria. The major concentration camps were in Deir ez-Zor and Ras Al Ain or Sedekani. Or if they were expelled after 1932 into what at the time was, Iraq, or the British mandate in Iraq, or into northern Syria. And so this is the other reason why the people who lived there in northern Syria, many of their families are traced to the Turkish side of the border, and they still identify in that way. And as I was interviewing people in the Northeast, they would often refer to their family on the Turkish side of the border and how they were deported or fled or escaped into northern Syria.
Perhaps then we can turn now to, there's a lot more arguments that you cover in the book, and about how things are operating now on the ground in northern Syria. What approach did you take with conducting with this research? What was new about it, and what challenges did you face in that process?
So I started this in 2015 as a survey of what I thought was, I was only, focusing on the YPJ because I actually started in the summer of 2015 before the SDF was officially created. So I thought I was just doing a survey of Kurdish women. I was planning to only focus on women, Kurdish women in the YPJ. And then, of course, within a few months, the SDF was created in the fall of 2015, and then it expanded. And when I would go back to Syria over the years, I saw how the SDF kept growing and expanding and becoming more diverse, including Arabs, Assyrians, Armenians, Syrian Turkmen, Yazidis, etc. And so I just realized that, my own understanding of this region needed to be revised. And I was also seeing that in some of the other reporting about the area that continued to refer to the SDF as a Kurdish force, etc. But so I started really with this survey. That's really what started this. And I would, I traveled to the different bases of the SDF. And I would, hand out the survey. It was a paper survey. At some point I used tablets, but over 400 men and women in the SDF took my survey. And so that was kind of the original data that I collected about the current situation, in addition to interviews with over 100 officials in the autonomous administration as well. Because the other thing I realized was that, of course, as territory was liberated from ISIS, governing structures were set up. And so that was the other thing that I think is still an misunderstood aspect of this region, that they created a local government as they liberated territory from ISIS. And that's still something that many people outside Syria, including here in the United States and Europe, et cetera, I think don't fully understand.
What, as you've mentioned, you particularly took this approach of doing a survey, and that's something that's unusual about the book, and I'm kind of interested in that because, to my mind, it adds something new, and it's kind of a sort of a new departure in terms of research on northern Syria. What was your intention with that, and also what more could be done if you were going to write another book with 10 times the resources, or what other kind of research could be done in this way?
I was trying to understand, basic demographic information about who they were. Where were they born? What did their parents do? Did they go to school? Did they finish high school? What was their level of education? What was their ethnicity, their religion, their, so sort of basic demographic information. But I also, of course, their gender. But I also was asking about their plans for the future. Like, what did they want to do after they defeated ISIS? What was their vision for the future? And when I started this in 2015, at the time, Kurds in Iraq, the KDP and the PUK, but especially Barzani, had officially said they were going to move forward with an independence referendum. They had already said this in 2015. The referendum didn't happen until 2017, but in that time, 2015, 2016, 2017, there was this assumption that if Kurds in Iraq were going to move forward with an independence referendum, probably Kurds in Syria wanted the same thing. And this was something that I also realized was actually, I think, a misunderstanding and a misconception of this region, because my survey data showed that actually a majority of the members in the SDF did not want to have any sort of, they did not have the intention of separating from Syria. They want to remain part of Syria, even as the SDF grew bigger and controlled more territory. And so that's another thing that I think was surprising for me, and I think that is also still misunderstood. But so I wanted to understand their reasons for joining the SDF, and also their plans for the future.
And it's sort of, I suppose, it seemed to me like kind of with this approach, I think one of the benefits that any kind of statistical work brings is it enables you to draw more comparisons, to argue for certain things to be taken more seriously, to bring them into the light. Like some of my favorite passages in the book are where you take statistics about, for example, gender representation in the SDF, and you compare it to gender representation within the United Nations itself. And you do the same thing with a couple of other bits of information, kind of in quite a sort of clear way to say, hey, look, something here is happening, and it's kind of worth engaging with, and here are the receipts, as they say. Was your aim with this also to kind of try and speak to policymakers, to people in the United States, to encourage them to take a different approach to the region?
Yes, absolutely. I gave this example of the women, peace, and security agenda that was already declared and in the year 2000, actually, where the United Nations committed to increasing the number of women in specifically security forces, as well as other organizations and bodies. And yet, the UN didn't live up to their own sort of goal that they had set for themselves, whereas the SDF actually exceeded that goal by having, as approximately 30%, possibly more, a minimum of 30% women in the SDF, and then also now between 40 and in some cases 50% women being represented in the governing structure of the autonomous administration, depending on the region and the institution. And so I just want, I find it ironic that, the United Nations, with this big, powerful organization that has the resources to promote women, for example, has kind of failed to do so, at least according to their own, the standards that they had set for themselves. Whereas this non-state actor in a poor region in a poor country manages to do this. I mean, we have to sort of ask ourselves why, and also why, if the SDF and the Autonomous Administration, they are living up to this expectation of, promoting women both in military structures and in the political structures, or the governing structures of the Autonomous Administration, why are they excluded from the talks in Geneva that are supposed to resolve the Syrian conflict? I mean, the most gender egalitarian region of Syria has been excluded. Although we know, cross-national research that's been done now for many, many years around the world has shown that including women actually is beneficial to entire societies. It's not just beneficial for those women, but to entire societies. And so if we know that empirically, why are policymakers not drawing the obvious conclusion of trying to support this project that is attempting to include women in a very sort of, I think, remarkable way, right? It's not just token representation. It's not just having a few women, sit at the table, but actual, trying to really include women at the same level as men.
Yeah, and so we've sort of seen the kind of US policy towards the region time and again of engaging in sort of a degree of military support, military engagement, keeping a few boots on the ground, keeping its foot in the door, but very much not wishing to engage with these kind of broader political diplomatic structures, as you mentioned, with the Geneva negotiations and so on. A recent example of that has been the United States opposition to the proposed municipal elections that were supposed to take place recently in the region, were postponed, and now supposed again to take place in August. What do kind of the findings in your book say about this electoral process and what the United States should be doing about it?
Right. So the elections that were supposed to take place, I think it was June 11, is when they had said they were going to hold these elections. That happened after I published my book. Yeah. But, I think that my book can help understand the significance of those elections. And also, I mean, I used to teach at the American University in Cairo, and I lived in Egypt before the revolution that overthrew Mubarak, during the revolution, after the revolution, the Muslim Brotherhood, Sisi. So I saw this, and I experienced myself this tumultuous trend, what we thought was a transition to democracy at the time in 2011 and after 2012, until the coup in 2013. And I think now, looking back, because I lived in Egypt at the time, and I remember thinking at the time, after Mubarak was toppled, and then the so-called Supreme Council of Armed Forces, this military junta, essentially took over governing Egypt until there were elections in 2012, and that's when the Muslim Brotherhood Morsi was elected. I think those elections in 2012 happened too quickly, because it was like a year and 3 months after Mubarak had been toppled, and 1 year and 3 months approximately is actually, it's really not enough time for people who have for 30 years lived under a dictator, right? And they don't have the experience necessary to know, how do we form political parties? How should we hold elections? How do we do this? How do we just technical things about holding elections, right? But, so now I think those elections happened too quickly, because the main, the Egyptian youth and young people who went out and overthrew Mubarak, who went out and demonstrated in millions, in the millions, they didn't have their own political party. They didn't have time to form a political party. They didn't, so it was an election between the Muslim Brotherhood and the old Mubarak regime in 2012. Those were the two options that people could vote for. So, but in Syria, it's been more than 5 years since they defeated the Islamic State as a caliphate, March 2019. It's been more than 5 years. It's been more than 12 years since the Assad regime withdrew from the north. So I think they have had enough time to form political parties, to, gain the necessary experience, to start to try to understand, how do we form political parties? How could we go about holding an election? And so my point is that if we tell them now, it's not the right time to hold elections, when will it be the right time? I mean, so my point is that the timing of elections in countries that are trying to transition away from authoritarian rule is really important. They shouldn't happen too quickly, but they also shouldn't be delayed indefinitely. So the timing of elections really, really does matter. And personally, I think, it was a mistake to tell them not to hold elections. I understand that they were concerned about, renewed threats from Turkey. And I understand that there's a need to focus on, basic services, so that people have water, electricity, especially after the civilian infrastructure. Some of it has been destroyed through the Turkish drone and airstrikes. But, holding elections is also an important part of a transition process. And, I think that having elections that would be, monitored by international observers would be really important. And that for those international observers to then, have access to polling stations, be able to write reports, say what they did right, what did they do wrong, what should they do better. I mean, that's a normal process of countries that are going through democratic transitions. And I think we should allow this to take place in the Northeast.
Yeah, absolutely. I will continue following the situation. Amy has also written a useful recent, short piece, I think, for the Wilson Centre. On the elections, which you can also find covered on this website and on Google. We are coming to the end of this discussion now. I wanted to finish with this one line from your book, which was, I think, it's in line with some other interesting work that's been done on Syria, northern Syria, and speaks to the complexities of what's happening in the region. So you write, herein lies a contradiction, but also the very secret to the autonomous administration's success. In order to survive and manage the territory, state-like structures were created despite an ideology that rejects statehood. So, on the one hand, you will hear people saying this is, it's a sort of direct democratic, decentralized, almost utopia. It's an idea that some people have about the region. On the other extreme, you will hear people saying, well, this is just a kind of Kurdish-run statelet or state implementing kind of gains to suit a Kurdish elite. And so in the course of your kind of broad assessment of what's happening in northern Syria, what's the kind of reality on the ground, and why did you choose this word statelet for your title?
Sure. So I think that what they've created is, despite the ideology of democratic confederalism and, talking about a stateless democracy, which they want to create, the reality of the situation in Syria required that someone fill the vacuum after the Assad regime withdrew in 2012, and after then the Islamic State was officially defeated in 2019 as a caliphate. And so, there are other parts of the world where the United States has been involved in a conflict, but then did not support the creation of governance structures, and their power vacuums have emerged that have been ungoverned. And ungoverned spaces are usually a recipe for further instability or for further malign actors to take advantage of. And so I think that the fact that this is a governing structure, which, I call it a statelet because it's a small state, like a micro-state or a mini-state within the Syrian state, that essentially functions because they do basic things. They're collecting taxes now. I mean, they're not implementing it everywhere, but they've been collecting taxes. They've been defending the region. They control the Samalka-Fish-Khabur border crossing. They control border crossings to the regime or cross-line crossings, and they're trying to provide services to the population, which are basic functions of a state. And so that's why I chose the term statelet. And, I think that that's essentially an accurate way to describe this region. But I also think that what they've done could be, essentially implemented or recognized within the context of the existing laws in Syria. There is a law on local administration, Kanun Idariya Mahaliya, the local administration law. They actually have a law that would allow decentralization, in Syria to be more formally recognized. And so what they're doing, this project of decentralization is not a project that aims for separation like the Kurds in Iraq, but it does aim to govern this region in a way that's quite different from the Assad regime in Damascus.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Amy, for sharing these quite diverse reflections with us. The book covers a lot of ground and different ideas, different aspects of what's happening in northern Syria. Again, it's called Statelet of Survivors, and you can find that via the link below or online from Oxford University Press. Amy, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. This has been the Kurdistan Connection. Until the next episode, goodbye.